Okay, thank you so much for having me. This is super exciting. I have so much to say today, and I appreciate your attention. The invite is so well received. Um, there's a lot we're going to cover. I do talk fast. I probably put more information in the slides than I'll cover. My hope is that if there's anything that you're interested in taking a deeper dive with, you can do so later with the PDF. The presentation is going to be a little bit of a story of my career and how I got into these topics. And the first part is going to focus on food addiction, and then we're going to switch over to intuitive eating. Someone said the sound is low. How about that? The mic's a little bit closer. Is that good? Okay, that's the best I can do unless there's more instruction. Feel free to follow on social media. As mentioned, I'm the founder and owner of Nutrition and Recovery. I don't have any financial conflicts of interest. However, I do think I'm pretty biased towards seeing nutrition through the lens of mental health. I think it's the future, and I've been blogging about it at wisemindnutrition.com. Highly recommend checking out that website. I don't have any dietary preferences to disclose. I do think it should be important that nutrition researchers, if they have a particular way of eating that might bias or color perspectives about food, that should be shared. So I try to be somewhat of a dietary agnostic, although I do have some points of view that I will be sharing with you today. Because we're going to make today a little bit more of a philosophical discussion, I want to introduce a couple key terms. The first is dialectics. This is the art of investigating and discussing truths of varying opinions. So we are going to go there today. It's also any systematic reason or exposition or argument that juxtaposes opposed or contradictory ideas and seeks to resolve their conflict. That's the whole point of today's talk. It's a method of examining and discussing opposing ideas in order to find the truth. But of course, what if there are multiple truths? One of the most profound things I learned studying statistics was that all models are wrong and some of them are useful. So in science, we use modeling to make a particular part or feature of the world easier to understand, define, quantify, visualize, or simulate by referencing it to existing and usually commonly accepted knowledge. So with data, we build models to detect associations, and those help us make predictions. But we also do this in our minds and in our bodies. And this is important. It promotes our survival by helping us to detect threats. It increases our efficiency in life, right? Whether that be for survival or small basic tasks. So for example, a nutrition counselor who has a food philosophy, has a belief system, is using a model, right? A psychiatrist who likes specific medications and just sticks to those might be using a model. So this helps things go smoothly, right? There's I have a thing that I do. People that come to me get the thing that I do. And I think that that's great, but I'm going to point out the deficiencies with that, with respect to dietetics, nutrition, and psychology. Another term is convergence. This is the act of converging toward union or uniformity. It's a point where two or more data points or pieces of information encounter one another. This is the commonality between theories where the overlap can serve to support or validate the other theory. That's a big part of where this is headed. And then divergence. This is a situation in which two things become different or the departure point for conceptual frameworks. Bias is also an important term. It's an inclination of temperament or outlook. It could be some sort of systematic error that's introduced into sampling or testing by selecting or encouraging one outcome or answer over another. It could also be an unfair opinion that influences someone's judgment. We know that bias in any process at any stage of inference tends to produce results or conclusions that differ systematically from the truth. So, a big part of today is talking about food addiction, which has definitely been controversial and has, in my opinion, been susceptible to a lot of biased ways of thinking. Confirmation is an unconscious act of referencing only those perspectives that fuel a pre-existing view, filtering out feedback that doesn't help in supporting our assumptions. And then we also have the bandwagon effect, what I like to call groupthink. This is where group members may agree upon a decision that deviates from the correct decision just for the sake of attaining harmony and avoiding conflict. And then lastly, anchoring bias is a tendency to rely too heavily on the first preferred piece of information when making decisions. Cognitive dissonance is a state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially related to behavioral decisions and attitude chains. It could be a feeling of mental discomfort that leads to an alteration in one of those attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors in order to reduce that discomfort and eventually restore balance. So when someone has some inconsistency between attitudes or behaviors, that's the dissonance. They must do something to eliminate that dissonance. And this is where the mind comes in. Individuals in a state of cognitive dissonance often take steps that are unconscious to resolve it. And then we have extrapolation. This is an action of estimating or concluding something by assuming that whatever trends are happening will continue or that a current method will remain applicable. Examples include, this is what works for me, so it should work for you. This is what most of my clients experience, so it must be what you're experiencing. And eating disorders are all about the pursuit of thinness. Eating disorders are all about restriction. Eating disorders are all about control. I'm going to say that I'm an eating disorder dietitian, so a lot of this information is seen through the lens of eating disorders, particularly with the goal of making some progress in the field. So my group practice, Nutrition and Recovery, has been around for 10 years. We're a group practice working in mental health. Since 2013, we've brought our services to over 50 treatment centers in Southern California, mostly substance use disorder, some eating disorder, and some mental health. As most of us know, the lines between some of these quote-unquote diagnostics are blurry. We do group facilitation and one-on-one care, mostly for disordered eating, and I've done some consulting work all over. And working in treatment has afforded me with some unique insight into eating behaviors associated with addictions. So I have a reputation of trying to make contributions in the space of addictions. And I have a personal story that's worth sharing today. And I don't normally share this, but between 2005 and 6, I did live in 3 residential treatment centers. I lived in a couple other unsafe places. I've been through hospital detox. I do come from a genetic legacy of alcoholism and chronic disease. Everyone on my mom's side of the family seems to die young. My mom right now is 71, full-blown dementia, currently in the hospital. And so I share that just to reduce some of the stigma around addictions, and to also let you know that people do get better around here. You can recover from addictions. And yeah, I have some, probably some bias or some love toward addiction recovery, which colors the work that I do. In 2012, when I was an intern, I ran my first nutrition and recovery group at a rehab where I got sober. So as a member of a sober community, it's important to acknowledge that it's not uncommon for people to cross-addict into other substances. We see caffeine, nicotine addiction, ultra-processed foods, sex, porn, gambling, gaming, shopping, scrolling, working, tech. This is all very well accepted phenomenon that's based on neurobiology. And I don't think anyone in the addiction world would negate any of this. This is cross-addiction, right? It's crystal clear. And you know, right before I went to graduate school, after sort of getting my life together, the Yale Food Addiction Scale was, introduced. It documents an abnormal desire for sweet, salty, and fatty foods. It uses diagnostic criteria based on the DSM-4 for withdrawal, tolerance, continued use despite negative consequences. And there's been great efforts to disentangle food addiction from binge eating disorder and other related conditions. We now have the Yale Food Addiction Scale 2.0. And there's a new trend toward using the term ultra-processed food addiction, which is the term that I use and the term that we're going to use today. And just to be clear, ultra-processed foods is defined using the NOVA classification, where there's 4 categories: unprocessed, minimally processed, and then you have processed culinary ingredients, and then processed foods, and then ultra-processed foods, which are basically formulations of ingredients. These are ingredients mostly of industrial use. Think about constituents of food rather than food, typically manufactured by a series of industrial practices, things like soda, snack cakes, reconstituted meats, etc. some data suggests that over half of the calories in the United States come from ultra-processed foods. The data that we do have shows that ultra-processed foods are consistently linked to poor mental health. We have depression, anxiety, irritable bowel, elevated cardiometabolic risk, cerebrovascular disease, elevated inflammatory markers, and of course, all-cause mortality. So I was very privy to some of these debates early on, especially as someone that's always been interested in eating disorders. You know, I followed the literature very closely, and I started to see some of the discourse. And some of the debates have always been, is this quote unquote diagnosis valuable for people with eating disorders? And we're going to get into this next one today. How do we know if the food addiction is an actual addiction or just a symptom of dieting behavior? We know that when people chronic diet, their food addiction symptoms increase, right? And that's what I'm going to call today a false positive, okay? Should food addiction better be called an eating addiction and viewed as a behavioral addiction rather than a substance-related addiction? And if someone does meet criteria for food addiction and doesn't have a dieting history or an eating disorder, how should we treat this person nutritionally? There are some clinical vignettes at the end. I don't know if we're going to have time to get into them. Depends on how many questions we have, but they are some really interesting kind of case studies that might elucidate some of these questions. So when I was an intern, 2012, I was very fortunate to receive training at the UCLA Medical Center. They had a world-renowned eating disorder unit. At that time, I wrote a book chapter on muscle dysmorphic disorder with the attending psychiatrist. So I was always interested in research from early on. I did a rotation at a well-known eating disorder IOP in West LA, and my master's thesis was called Nutrition and Substance Abuse, and that was at the VA in West LA. And this is where I fell in love with research. I fell in love with literature reviews, even things like going through IRBs. It all felt like it was the right fit for me. I started reading papers on food addiction and learning about neuroscience. So this was my first early effort. This was a textbook by one of my mentors, Dr. Timothy Brewerton, a psychiatrist who has really, done a lot of work to integrate, the fields of eating disorders and addictions. It's been clearly identified that these are generally very separate fields, and there seems to be some contention. A lot of patients get different information from these different providers, or people go to addiction treatment and then eating disorder treatment and then back to addiction treatment. And I think the main point of this book was to try to think about the intersection of these disorders and to think about, creating treatment that was concurrent rather than sequential. So these were some of my early works. You could see the chapter on muscle dysmorphia in men. And then we had a chapter, nutrition therapy for eating disorders, substance use disorders, and addiction. So I've been talking about this stuff for many years. I'm going to share some of my work with you, and then we're going to get into some of the philosophy. I was also involved in behavioral health nutrition very much early on as an intern and an early career dietitian. We used to do booths at conferences, and I met some other like-minded individuals. And BHN has a couple different subspecialties. There's eating disorders, there's addictions, there's mental health, and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And this was just big for my career. I kind of found the thing that I was interested in. I really departed from calories and fitness and sports nutrition, I think, while I was in grad school. And I was like, I want to go deeper. I want to learn about the brain, and I want to learn about the mind. And by the way, those are not the two, those are two different things, and we won't have time to get into that. But the way that my mind works is that all these different things resonated with me, learning about these different fields and learning about mental health and reading peer-reviewed literature from psychiatry, progressive thinkers like Mark Potenza, learning how to think outside of the box and not relying on DSM diagnoses or assuming all people with the same diagnoses would benefit from the same treatment. So I always, thought about things in terms of the nuance, the subtle differences, thinking about things on a continuum, on a spectrum, looking at heterogeneity in populations. And at this point, this is now, we're talking 2014, 2015, the world didn't feel as divided as it does now. There was much less us versus them energy, much less campsite culture in the nutrition space. So I really got interested in food addiction when I learned that the food companies were using the neuroscience of eating behavior to maximize addiction. Now, just to clarify, I haven't done a lot of research in food addiction, because of my own personal relationship with food. I mentioned that I had some addiction history, but it really wasn't my thing. This was my thing. I was interested in social justice and health equity. And when I learned that there were food companies that were engineering food for maximum profit at the expense of public health, it pissed me off. And I said, I need to know more about this. And it really, really got my attention. I don't know if anyone's been around in the field for long enough, but we started a group called Dietitians for Professional Integrity. We've since dissolved our efforts, but this was a group of dietitians that basically, put our reputation on the line to make a stand against our parent organization. There was a lot of, seemingly unscrupulous activities related to corporate sponsorship. And we just took the position that sponsorship affects public perception of dietitians, and that a lot of the information that we received felt tainted by food industry interests, right? And so I don't know if anyone's been around for a while, but this was big. And we made our statements, we published them, and it really wasn't so much about food as it was about power and influence. A lot of our work was influenced by Marion Nestle, and it was really, really good times, sort of trying to change the paradigm. I started reading papers about how funding affected the conclusions in scientific articles. There was a lot of papers showing that industry funding of nutrition-related articles biased conclusions in favor of the sponsor's product, with potentially significant implications for public health. And then I really took a deep dive into the tobacco industry and the playbook that they used in order to, influence public narratives around their products. So I'm going to read the title of this, and I'm going to read it slow. It says, "The Perils of Ignoring History. Big Tobacco Played Dirty and Millions Died. How Similar is Big Food?" So I've always had this sort of renegade energy, like we can change the system, power to the people, right? The playbook that's been used has always, been focusing on individual agency, personal responsibility as the cause of the nation's unhealthy diet. They always tend to raise fears that any sort of government action usurps personal freedom. They vilify critics with totalitarian language, even calling people food fascists. They criticize studies that hurt the industry as junk science. They emphasize physical activity over diet. And here it is, folks. They state that there are no good or no bad foods. This is their playbook, right? Hence, no single food or food type should be targeted for change. And they always plant doubt when concerns are raised about the industry. So I was willing to put my career on the line. We were willing to write statements. A lot of people wanted to write statements and speak out about injustices, but a lot of people were too afraid to do so. Yeah. A lot of people are like, I believe in what you're doing, but I don't want to take a risk with my career. And I've seen that play out with a lot of dietitians. And I just want to encourage people to be courageous, deviate from the party line, listen to spirit, and honor your own truth, right? And I remember there was a time when I spoke out about corporate sponsorship, and I was disciplined. I think they thought I was dangerous because I was speaking about things that were different.
And like I said, the Academy has basically...
I have a recording, but I'm not going to share it. So I'm interested in conflict of interest, and that's where I got into food addiction. Food addiction and conflict of interest go hand in hand. I'm interested in public-private partnerships and what goes on behind the scene. It's always been thought that the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry are in cahoots. They put private profits ahead of public health. And this isn't necessarily a problem, that's non-specific. This is called capitalism, right? Corporations have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, have incredible resources to influence public discourse and to control narratives around health. We used to identify front groups. These were groups that were basically industry groups that were coming out and saying, we are science, we are the truth. But it really was, we are profit, we are corporation. And I think that, dietitians need to be more aware of this. A lot of dietitians were trained to be part of this kind of Western medicine model. It's been said that a sick society is a profitable society. Whenever people or groups speak up against big food or big ag or big pharma, we're attacked, discredited, called conspiracy theorists, purveyors of misinformation. And then here's where it gets good. Whenever someone expresses concern about food or the food industry, they're called orthorexics and perpetuators of diet culture. So let's talk about diet culture. And this is coming from someone who does most of my work with people that have eating disorders, okay? I'm gonna come out and say it. If someone doesn't wanna wave the flags and carry out the financial agenda of companies like Coke, Nestle, and General Mills, that's not diet culture, okay? Diet culture is a pervasive belief that appearance and body shape are more important than physical, psychological, and general well-being. It's an idea that controlling your body, particularly your diet, by limiting what and how you eat is normative behavior, okay? So pushing back on companies that have a complete monopoly on the food system is not the same thing as diet culture. And this is a point that I've been trying to make. These are certain companies that deliberately engineer food for the highest palatability using addiction neuroscience. They market their products to children, create reward expectancies that can persist for a lifetime. So what we're left with is people that grow up disliking the taste of plain food. And, some would argue that they're responsible for the global type 2 diabetes epidemic. So this is not diet culture. This is called public health. And I will say that public health has come short in a lot of ways. These public health, discourse, this anti-obesity rhetoric has been harmful, right? So public health has missed a lot of things, but I think public health can do a much better job of tackling food policy. So back to my story. In 2013, 14, 15, I took a lot of trainings. I did intuitive eating with Evelyn, who I think is fantastic. And we're going to talk about their model today. I studied trauma. A lot of my work has been on trauma-informed nutrition and how trauma affects biology. And I went to a lot of addiction conferences and some eating disorder conferences. And I noticed something that really caught my attention. There was very divergent perspectives about food addiction, compulsive eating, etc. And I was fascinated by it, right? Why is it that different groups see these things very differently? Okay, this is divergence. And I learned about the concept of discipline bias, where people's perspectives are colored by the field and the training that they've had, right? And this makes sense, right? It made sense to me that people in the addiction field were more likely to see food as having potentially addictive properties compared to people who were in the eating disorder field who treated anorexia nervosa and restrictive eating disorders, because they often would treat people who thought they had food addiction, but really had more restrictive psychopathology. It also made sense to me that dietitians seem to be the most vehemently opposed to food addiction. I was always shocked by this. Like in psychiatry, neuroscience, it doesn't seem to be debated, but in the nutrition field, it's like the most controversial, right? And I dug deep into the literature, and our parent organization has made some statements, about labeling foods as good or bad as not being helpful, and I do agree with that, by the way. And also stating that sugar addiction has not been proven. Again, these are old papers, but I think it's safe to say that that position is unlikely to change, perhaps due to some affiliation with big food. So my early efforts have been to incorporate science on food addiction into eating disorder. And this is what I've always done. My career has been dedicated to teaching the eating disorder community about food addiction and teaching the food addiction community about eating disorders. It does seem like, both camps kind of pretend like the other group doesn't exist. And I'm trying to bridge the gap, right? That's been my work. So I've proposed new models of conceptualizing and treating eating disorders that incorporates recent data on food addiction. So in this little framework, I've basically pitted food addiction as somewhat of the opposite to anorexia nervosa, where with anorexia nervosa, the treatment goal is to make peace with food, make peace with body, liberalize the diet. And it's really, not about the food. Whereas with food addiction, you need to focus on the nutrition and the exercise because the food does matter, right? There's craving, compulsive behavior, etc. So for someone that has binge eating disorder or bulimia nervosa, it can be determined based on the presence of other factors, for example, addiction history, if someone more resembles an addiction phenotype or resembles a restrictive phenotype, right? And this allowed for treatment to, determine if someone should need a different nutrition intervention. And it was really designed to help people get all on the same page about what's going on with someone. My next work really dove deep into animal models of addiction-like eating, and we looked at the maternal influence. And this is the kind of research that you can't really do in humans, where you could feed pregnant rodents with highly palatable food and study what happens in their offspring. And we found that maternal exposure to certain foods is capable of provoking neurobehavioral alterations in the offspring. And we call this addiction transfer via dysregulated reward systems that begins to develop in utero. Maternal ingestion of foods known to induce addiction-like eating can impact fetal neurodevelopment and subsequent ingestion behavior. So this was like a really deep dive into more of a life course perspective on food addiction, looking at it over longer periods of time, the generational legacy of ultra-processed foods, thinking about the timing during gestation, lactation, and some of these insults can occur, independent of postnatal nutrition. So this is, biologically embedded, right? We know that quote unquote junk food consumed during pregnancy can have lasting effects. For example, if you feed, a rodent nothing but chips and sugar and cookies during their pregnancy, their offspring are more susceptible to methamphetamine addiction, cocaine addiction, etc. In other words, it kind of lends itself to this question, like, how has ultra-processed food programmed society as a whole to be more susceptible to addiction-like processes? And then you throw in a little bit of stress, trauma, and adversity, throw in some tech addiction, some impulsivity, and then boom, we have the addiction crisis that we're in today, right? So a greater understanding of this addiction transfer will help us develop effective interventions. So, we made some recommendations for eating during pregnancy, having balanced macronutrients, and then of course, reducing exposure to ultra-processed foods. My next paper really looked at animal models in conjunction with the human literature to really understand how the mesolimbic dopaminergic projection is involved in reward, and how eating palatable foods is much like drug addiction. Okay, so we took the 11 criteria for substance use disorder from the DSM and analyzed the data from both animals and humans to see if there was a fit. And I just want to read some of these criteria just so you're aware of substance use disorder. We have using larger amount for longer than intended, craving, hazardous use, tolerance, withdrawal. So originally, the major arguments against the food addiction construct was that there wasn't good evidence for tolerance and withdrawal. And, I don't have time to get into it today, but yeah, there are good data to support the concept of tolerance and withdrawal in both animals and humans. So the food addiction construct has made some significant progress, albeit very controversial because it's not clear what to do once that's been determined. And my hope is that I can offer you some clinical pearls related to that today. So just to read some greatest hits from that paper, the conclusion suggests giving more consideration to the impact of highly palatable foods for some people seeking eating disorder treatment. Most of the food addiction literature, like I said, sort of ignores eating disorders. But I've always made an effort to say, how is it relevant to eating disorders? Because you can't just separate things. You can't just say, there's this over here and there's this over here. Everything exists as an overlap, right? And that's where I've always been interested. I also argued in this paper that processed food addiction in humans is more like caffeine or nicotine than it is like cocaine or heroin. There were some headlines many years ago, sugar is more addictive than cocaine. And while that may be true for a very, very small subset of the population, I think sugar addiction, food addiction is more subtle. It's way more subtle, like caffeine. Most people don't even know they have it, right? You ask someone why they like coffee, they're like, I just like the taste. Yeah, okay, you like the taste, but those compounds activate neural circuitry that end up assigning value to that experience. We call this salience. And then the person is likely to repeat the behavior again. So I think that's an important point. Another point I made is that food addiction is an individual problem, yes, but it's really a collective problem that should be addressed on a societal level. And then I moved into thinking about dietary restraint and its relevant. This is the concept of restrained eating, or what some people call restrictive eating. It's been suggested, and I've seen this in my clinical practice, that when people misapply restraint, try to overdo it, undereat, it can make eating pathology much worse. So this needs to be discussed when we talk about food addiction. So this is when I really started to think about divergent explanatory theories to understand the directionality of these relationships. So for example, the common model in the eating disorder world is that dietary restraint drives binge eating, and that binge eating drives dietary restraint. And I'm going to be, a little critical here and say that in the eating disorder world, it seems like this is their only model. In the intuitive eating world, it seems like this is the only model that they think exists. And, I would go further and say that there are other models, right? This is the food addiction. The food environment drives the addiction theory, is that highly palatable foods are actually what's driving dietary restraint. And that we have people who consume highly palatable foods that can eventually develop an addiction-like relationship with food without having any dieting. There's people that develop food addiction without any dieting. So there's different ways to look at these things. And what I've really been trying to encourage dietitians and researchers to do is, instead of thinking about like, what's your one model, think about how multiple models exist. So in that chapter, we debated some things, and I as a scholar, I'm here to argue against food addiction as well. And I think you'll see in some of my more recent papers, I talk about the shortcomings of food addiction. I am not a food addiction, torch carrier. I am very critical of the science. Okay, so we argued that we need food, but not drugs to survive. Therefore, food addiction can exist. We made the debate that food addiction could be relevant to eating disorders. And then we made the debate about restriction rather than food addiction is what dysregulates eating. Therefore, the notion of food addiction does more harm than good by encouraging restriction. So I've always really focused on the potential harms of the food addiction construct. And then in conclusion, we said, yes, individualized treatment can be helpful, but really what would be helpful is targeting the food environment through public health interventions. I think that would be the best way to reduce addiction-like eating, reduce chronic dieting, and then eventually reduce eating disorder incidence, which I think is important. Another criticism of food addiction is that it's been thought to be a perpetuator of, stigma. That it's a stigmatizing condition, that there's stigma associated with addiction. And yes, there is some truth to that. But if you look at substance use disorder, once we understand the neurobiology of the condition, it actually reduces stigma. Okay, so in a couple studies, and there's a handful, I only shared one, when people got a food addiction explanation, it resulted in a lower stigma than diet and exercise. So a lot of times, in our society, people assume that they should be able to manipulate their body weight by, food and exercise, and that they should be able to weigh what they want. And if they can't, they have, problems with their own control and responsibility, whereas food addiction really pushes back on those assumptions. We know that weight stigma is a serious problem. It's really exciting to see this emerging as the next social justice movement. I use terms like sizeism, right? And it's a problem at a societal level, and it often gets internalized. And I've been making the argument that internalized weight stigma is a form of stress, trauma, and adversity. It creates a vicious cycle We know that there's some negative effects of stigmatization at the biological level, such as cortisol, which can sensitize the reward system. This can increase oxidative stress, and it's really been proposed that we need to adopt weight-inclusive health policy. I was very fortunate to do my PhD at UCLA, and in the health psychology department, there's some incredible researchers who have done some work with weight stigma. So shout out to Dr. Tamayama. And then, yes, I tried to bring food addiction into the context of psychosocial adversity and think about how stress, trauma, and adversity increase susceptibility to addictions and addiction like eating, and then putting it into the context of the larger social and environmental piece. So instead of just looking at food addiction as a driver of BMI, we look at food addiction as a function of stress, trauma, and adversity and how that can be biologically embedded. I am going to talk about biological embedding later on today. I have another talk on depression and depressive symptoms. I've talked a lot about trauma and how it affects physiology in ways that affect eating behavior. I'm not going to get into that a lot today, but I want you to know that there's a lot there. I'm happy to share some resources, and please show up to the talk later on today. But of course, when we think about stress, trauma, and adversity, we have to look at the upstream drivers, SES. We also have to think about how SES affects the food environment that someone lives in and how that can also contribute. And then not looking at obesity, quote unquote, obesity as the outcome, but really thinking about how obesity drives weight stigma and how weight stigma is a form of stress, trauma, and adversity that increases addiction like eating, and how weight stigma, especially when it becomes internalized, can drive dieting, and how dieting can actually increase food addiction symptoms. So this is a comprehensive model. You know, when you start reading a lot of papers and looking at a lot of data, you start thinking about signal flow, directionality, conceptual models. And this is, you know, an example of how we have to think about broader contextual factors and thinking about how early life adversity can be socially patterned. Dietary restraint is a cognitive effort to eat less in order to lose weight. It's included in the model as a risk factor for eating pathology, commonly associated with eating disorders. We know that people that are actively monitoring their diet, it's stressful, right? And we know that restriction can increase cortisol. We know that engaging in dieting can have the opposite effect. And we know that dietary restraint is likely to increase food addiction symptoms, okay? So this is one of the shortcomings with the addiction model. So just a couple greatest hits from that paper. And this is really just thinking more from a public health perspective, given what we know about early life adversity and addictions, that certain prevention efforts probably have a more meaningful impact upstream. And we'll talk about that as we wrap up later today, that we need to think about trauma-informed treatment, bringing stress management curriculum into schools and underserved communities as a way of reducing addiction like eating, okay? And that public health intervention should account for the growing inequities in health outcomes. So I've made some hypotheses. It's not unreasonable that highly palatable foods can leave a biological imprint, which might perpetuate food addiction symptoms across the lifespan and into subsequent generations, right? It remains unclear if the negative health effects are due, the negative health effects of food addiction. I think this is an important point. It's unclear if the negative health effects of food addiction are because of the direct impact of the processed food, or if it's the displacement of nutrient-dense, high-fiber foods that we know are protective against oxidative stress and associated inflammation. In other words, is the real problem with food addiction the sugar, salt, fat in the foods that people eat? Or is it the fact that once they start eating those foods, they're not actually eating a lot of other, you know, plain foods, right? It's really an interesting way to look at it, especially for the youth. We have kids growing up eating ultra-processed foods. I wouldn't say that it's the ultra-processed foods that are harming their health. I would say it's the lack of all the other foods that are harming their health, right? And that this term processed food addiction implicates the food industry rather than the individual. We did a systematic review and meta-analysis linking ACEs to BMI. We pooled all the cross-sectional data, and our results found a 46% increase in the odds of adult obesity following exposure to multiple ACEs. Part of our efforts were to read the papers and see what authors proposed as potential mechanisms. We saw that food addiction is a less known yet biologically plausible explanation for the relationship between ACEs and BMI, and that awareness of the food addiction construct has important implications for society, challenging the common assumption that all eating behavior is simply a choice, but rather for some, a consequence of chronic exposure to highly palatable foods in a biologically based coping mechanism for trauma. And then I took it one step further to help discern food addiction from dietary restraint. And we proposed a model that could help identify true positives, which we call signals, versus false positives, which we call noise. So this paper was called Separating the Signal from the Noise, How Psychiatric Diagnoses Can Help Discern Food Addiction from Dietary Restraint. We proposed an eight-step process, I should say, to help discern. So once you identify food addiction, you then look for dietary restraint. You could use eating disorder screening tools. And then you look at addiction history, both in the person and the family. And then you look for PTSD symptoms. And then you look for early life adversity. And there's some steps here to help clinicians understand if this is actually food addiction or if it's more a relic of chronic dieting. And in the model, we suggest that clinicians should go beyond the no dieting approach for all eating disorder presentations and need to incorporate addiction neuroscience. When food alters dopamine circuitry, efforts to moderate become more difficult and intuitive eating can feel impossible. So if a patient's in eating disorder treatment and they're getting the all foods fit philosophy, but they're consistently eating low fiber foods intuitively and have non-resolving depressive symptoms, it may indicate that a more targeted nutrition strategy is warranted. So I'm going to be talking about depression later on today, but I want to just introduce the systematic review that came out of these incredible colleagues in Australia that looked at 7 randomized controlled trials and found that 7 out of 7 showed evidence that dietary interventions, counseling, etc., can improve depressive symptoms. So I guess the question, and we'll come back to this maybe later today, is like, what if someone has an eating disorder and they have depression? What are you going to do? So the greatest hits from that paper, it seems that until we can determine who's a good candidate for a food addiction-based nutrition intervention, food addiction science will continue to stimulate disagreement. So couple unanswered questions that I just want to kind of leave everyone with and maybe come back to. Where does all the dieting come from in the first place? If it's all diet culture and it's a problem, diet culture is a problem, where does diet culture come from, right? And how have sociocultural influences ingrained these highly palatable foods into the brain's reward expectancy, right? We expect more reward from food. And can public health interventions aimed at reducing exposure to highly processed foods eventually reduce food addiction and subsequently reduce chronic dieting? And I've made this statement that the impact of contemporary westernized foods may actually be contributing to poor eating disorder treatment outcomes. And then we did a paper on the protective measure theory. I don't know if anyone's heard this, but I'm sure some of you had. There's a model called the protective measure theory that purports individuals exposed to sexual abuse will deliberately or subconsciously gain weight in an attempt to prevent future victimization. And this came from psychodynamic theories from the 1980s and 90s. And I heard it a lot in my practice. And then I just said one day, let's do a deep dive. Let's do a deep literature review. Is there evidence for this? And what might be some of the updated evidence? Now, I'm not saying that model is wrong. I'm just saying that it's not complete. So a more comprehensive understanding of the mechanisms by which childhood sexual abuse becomes biologically embedded can help people understand, normalize, and address disordered eating. So this is the model, and I'm not going to get into it, but I guess, what's important is that when we think about trauma, the outcomes that I've always been interested in, and these aren't outcomes in this model, is substance use disorder, eating disorder, and food addiction, and how these all cluster, co-occur, overlap, converge, and diverge, right? And that's the whole kind of point of this talk. traditional eating disorder perspectives don't typically consider food addiction as an upstream driver. And yes, we stated in the paper, while this concept of barrier weight may have some support as well as some merit, we think that, telling patients that, they're doing this to protect them from being attractive may actually be perpetuating weight stigma, and that, we need to think about pathways of embodiment and mechanistic explanations to understand these relationships. So I'm super into science. Are you? And I think that if you exclusively gather data from a single theoretical perspective, it makes it impossible to evaluate the validity of the theory that's being tested against other theoretical perspectives, and that the omission of variables that operationalize competing theories from the analysis may lead to misleading results. So I've had some incredible training in the Fielding School of Public Health. So we're going to switch over to intuitive eating pretty soon. But I want to give you a little bit more science on food addiction. There was a systematic review published recently that looked at how many times this has been mentioned. So food addiction has been mentioned, and I think close to 3,000 peer-reviewed papers. So if you look at 4,000 now, yeah, probably more than 4,000. Just to look at the citation history, and you can pull this information from PubMed. I just pulled it real quick. In 20 years, food addiction was mentioned, 10 times more than intuitive eating. And I only offer that to say that I think a lot of dietitians, I've heard dietitians say food addiction is pseudoscience. It's not real. And, a lot of these papers, are arguing pros and cons of it, but it's pretty obvious that this is a valid scientific endeavor. Okay. I think the last paper that I'll share with you guys that I did, and this is recently, clinical considerations of ultra-processed food addiction across different weight classes, bringing in eating disorder treatment and care. So just to walk you through something very briefly, as BMI category goes up, food addiction prevalence goes up, right? And that's intuitive. That makes sense. But then if you do a little bit more of a fine-grained perspective and you break it down into smaller categories, you can see that in the underweight category, food addiction prevalence goes up. And so this begs the question, why? What's going on here? And it turns out that people that are deprived, restrained, underweight can oftentimes perceive food addiction. A lot of times, it's a questionnaire. It's a self-report. So it's like, do you experience loss of control with these foods? Like when you eat, do you have yada, yada, yada? So they're asking questions about someone's perception of their relationship with food. And if someone, for example, has an eating disorder, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and they're underweight, they score really high on the food addiction scale, right? So the point of this paper, if you're interested in it, it's open access, is to describe, where the food addiction construct comes short. I also point out that we need to think about it as a behavioral disorder, not a weight disorder. I'm not a weight-focused person, but in data, that is a variable that we do look at. And that, importantly, ultra-processed food addiction is seen in people that don't have eating disorders, right? Or other psychiatric disorders in the general population, which suggests that it's a distinct entity from eating disorders and other psychiatric illness. So we talk about targeting the internalization of weight bias, regardless of how much someone weighs, and that this work has to be done through an eating disorder-informed weight neutral lens. Otherwise, food addiction science can be dangerous, okay? And then if approaching this clinically, it may take several sessions, including some trial and error and some discussion of the pros and cons of different approaches before treatment trajectories become clear. So sometimes people come to me because they think they have food addiction, and that I, really tell them that I don't think they do. That's a common thing that happens. I've also had people that have come to me using a more inclusive, all foods fit approach that hasn't worked for them. And I might say that they might have some addiction-like neurobiology that's making it difficult. So if you're looking for treatment recommendations, this is what I've published last year. If it is determined that there's a true signal for food addiction as a distinct entity, there are some recommendations, right? Meal strategies, 3 meals plus. I like 3 meals and 2 snacks. It should be consistent in nutrients, yet varied in experience. I'm really big in building in hot food, cold food, crunchy, creamy, savory, sweet, all of the sensory and tactile experiences. And yes, it is okay to help people that have addiction like neurobiology to eat lower glycemic carbs, to identify trigger foods. And that can change over time, right? There can be foods that are problematic for someone, and that can be changed over time. Switching the goal from weight loss to improving mental health, teaching people how to cook at home, mindful eating, soulful eating, emotional regulation, and social support. And then this book chapter is coming soon. It just looks at food addiction as it relates to dietary restraint, and dietary restraint as it relates to body dissatisfaction, and how this can create a cycle, and how eating disorders can moderate some of these relationships. A couple of points I want to make about restraint, and then I'm pretty sure we're going to switch into intuitive eating. Restraint is unclear. A lot of people see any form of trying to modify your diet as restraint. Like I've heard people say that if someone doesn't have celiac and they choose not to eat wheat, that they're dieting, right? And I mean, I've seen people go to extremes. So what if someone doesn't want to eat less? They just want to eat differently, right? Focusing on quality. Is that pathological, right? Some people would say it is, and that some people that engage in restraint that is pathological, as I mentioned before, could have higher levels of food addiction severity. And of course, we have the growing problem of orthorexia nervosa, which can definitely be pathological. But I think people throw that term around a little bit much. I do think it's a problem, but I think if someone has, early life trauma, addiction, impulsivity, they have, immune system issues, wanting to be intentional and deliberate about their food should not be pathological, right? So yes, overlooking a true food addiction positive, and just telling someone just eat in moderation can make people worse, okay? And clinicians who endorse a broad range of nutritional and therapeutic approaches should be able to provide personalized treatment. So in my practice, the significant majority of the work I do is food positive, food inclusive, eating disorder treatment and care. Some people have co-occurring addictions, many don't. And then a much smaller percentage of the work I do is with people who identify as being in recovery from food addiction, needing ongoing support. Some people are in 12-step programs, some not. I occasionally do endorse abstinence-based approaches when it's deemed to be clinically appropriate. That means deemed by me to be clinically appropriate. And I use the term endorse to suggest I wouldn't push someone toward that. I wouldn't feel comfortable pushing someone towards some really extreme abstinence-based approach. But if someone is really getting called to move in that direction and it feels clinically appropriate, I can support someone. Do you understand the difference? So usually whatever someone's dealing with, the work is focused on moving people toward body positivity, joy, and peace. So we live in a world where there's boxes, and boxes make people feel safe. We need to break down walls and help people get free. And this is called non-duality. And this is the essence of my message at Wise Mind Nutrition, which I highly recommend you check out the website and social media. So intuitive eating is a revolution that essentially came from a book in 1995. 2 dietitians wrote it, and it has completely changed the game. It's based on 10 principles. The first is reject the diet mentality. So this is the idea of being non-diet, honoring your hunger, staying well-fed, making peace with food, giving yourself unconditional permission to eat, challenging the food police, maybe taking a look at your rules and old ideas around food and body, respecting fullness, body trust, discovering the satisfaction factor, eating what you want, right? Honoring feelings without using food, respecting your body, exercising, feeling the difference, and then honoring health, right? So I've introduced more nuance into the intuitive eating model. I think that intuitive eating can also include intuitively knowing what foods to eat less of, because intuitive eating should be about trust and individuality. You can see I've bolded number 3 and number 6, and we're going to come back to those as things that can be nuanced, right? Things that can be modified for people that have addiction like eating. Now, intuitive eating is consistently associated with, across the literature, lower levels of rigidity, lower levels of psychological distress, less disordered eating, more positive body image, and less anti-fat attitudes, greater emotional functioning, greater psychological adjustment, better self-esteem, improved mental health, and overall well-being. So it's definitely a marker of positive mental health, right? But the directionality is not clear, right? Is it that intuitive eating leads to these things, or that these things lead to intuitive eating, right? And let's just talk about the reality of it. Intuitive eating might actually be reflecting the absence of addiction history, lower levels of impulsivity, which can be influenced by genetic susceptibility, a less exposure to early life adversity, and overall privilege in society. A paper came out yesterday, I saw the preprint, that people that were food insecure had less ability to access intuitive eating, okay? And now, to be fair, intuitive eating does make a greater effort to account for the structural marginalization that exists in society. One study of over 1,000 women found that intuitive eating was associated with more sleep, regular breakfast, more time spent practicing yoga, less recreational screen time, and this was after adjusting for other socio-demographic characteristics. When you looked at intuitive eating content on Instagram, it was found that it was mostly white women with a minimal portrayal of larger bodies. So we know that intuitive eating is consistently correlated with lower BMIs. And the question is, what is intuitive eating really capturing, right? Is it capturing eating disorder recovery, or is it really just capturing safety and privilege? So intuitive eating is a revolution. I stand by it. It's based on the assumption that we can trust our body wisdom. And I would say that if someone's gut is near homeostasis, they don't have addictions, their hormones are balanced, stable, they've been trained in mindfulness, yes, it is possible that someone could be fully in sync with their intuition. But if someone has gut dysbiosis, low-grade systemic inflammation, addiction, withdrawal, craving, a history of trauma, hormones all over the place, mindless eating, it's very difficult to assume that someone should be able to access their intuition. That doesn't mean that they can't access it at some point. It's just unrealistic to give someone that message, right? So yes, maybe our bodies do intuitively know what they need, but it's hard. It's really hard to listen to their whispers in an environment that shouts, right? So my opinion, and this diverges from the opinion of the intuitive eating community, is that intuitive eating works better when you eat minimally processed whole foods. You can trust your body signals so much more. So we have to think about biology. A calorie is not a calorie. It is sometimes about the food. The food industry continues to deny responsibility, always pointing back to personal responsibility. Psychological interventions, are not always sufficient. Educational efforts are not always sufficient. We need a public health intervention. So the problem with food addiction, and this is, the criticism of it, okay? It seems to be the newest way for diet culture to be disguised. It seems to be a socially acceptable diet club. You go online, you go on, social media, and you see coaches and other professionals endorsing keto and other extreme approaches, right? Cutting out, for example, all carbs. Based on the data, there's zero data to show that barley and kidney beans are addictive foods, right? So a lot of people are using food addiction as a model to just lose weight, okay? And I'm not here to criticize people who want to lose weight, but when people confuse and conflate weight loss with food addiction recovery, it gives food addiction a bad name. And when you look at the torch carriers of food addiction, the flag wavers, they tend to be older, thin, privileged white women who other people want to be like and look like, right? And it could be very hard to discern that from someone who's in an active eating disorder. So a lot of times people will be on these weighed and measured food plans, and they've been doing this for many years, right? And it's hard to know, like if you look at someone who's in a smaller body and they're weighing and measuring their food, like, is that food addiction recovery or is that an eating disorder, right? It's just like the blurriness between intermittent fasting and binge eating disorder. For one person, they don't eat all day and they have one large meal in the evening or something along those lines, and they're doing this incredible thing for their mental health. For the next person, that same exact pattern is a clinically significant eating disorder, right? So this is where we need people to think with discernment and outside of the box. The misconceptions are that with classic eating disorder, it's not about the food, and that with food addiction, it is, and that the eating disorder world is body positive, food addiction is negative, inclusive versus exclusive, non-shaming versus shaming, health at every size versus weight loss. And this is not true. You can find support for these misconceptions online, but those of us that do food addiction research are not thinking about it this way. This creates unnecessary polarization, and I'm going to go ahead and say enough with the black and white thinking, please. The goals are not weight focused. We're talking about harm reduction, disease progression, focusing on overall health, body, mind, spirit, behavior change, self-efficacy, sanity restoration, recovery, which can be difficult to measure, right? And eventually helping people develop a relationship with food and exercise that is intuitive and personal. And I've always stated this can also include intuitively knowing which foods to eat less of and avoiding the quick fix wherever possible. So food addiction treatment doesn't require abstinence, okay? Sometimes people can create abstinence plans based on behaviors. So instead of saying, I'm going to be abstinence from this food, you can say, I'm going to be abstinence from binge eating. I'm going to be abstinent from skipping meals. I'm going to be abstinent from ordering, delivery after a certain time. It may warrant reduced exposure, right? But it definitely requires recovery. And this is where, we bring in psychosocial support, trauma healing, meditation, breath work, yoga, all the things to help rewire the brain. And this doesn't happen in days and weeks. It often happens over months and more realistically years. And whatever the situation, any self-destructive black and white thinking should be challenged. And this is what we call cognitive restructuring. Okay, so here I'm going to go. Let's lean in. There seems to be a lot of debate in the field. Okay. Divergent views in the field may arise from a failure to separate advocacy from evidence, as well as training and discipline bias. And, I believe that science is about dialogue, not consensus, right? So it seems like there's been some consensus that have been reached, particularly in the eating disorder community, which I'm a part of. If you have very strong opinions about an issue, you might actually be departing from scientific processes. I think passion is great. You can probably tell I have tons of it, and social justice is everything. Let's put an end to sizeism. But when people get to a point when you can no longer hear a new perspective, it's very, very dangerous. So I'm going to share a short clip from one of the authors of Intuitive Eating from a recent podcast.
I wonder, just with the advances in the research, I just had Michael Moss on the show who just wrote a book called Hooked about the food addiction in the food industry, right? Oh, it's a great
I don't
book.
believe that at all. I don't believe one iota of that. So, okay. I don't believe in food addiction at all.
Okay, so just so you get a sense of where some of the discomfort comes from in the field, we have the authors of Intuitive Eating that don't believe one iota of this data, okay?
I wonder.
So intuitive eating is a powerful movement. It's at the foundation of my core beliefs as an eater and a practitioner. I do believe that it can be a part of the solution to ultra-processed food addiction. Ultra-processed food addiction is a public health problem, right? And intuitive eating can be an individual level solution. In many ways, this is what we call harm reduction, okay? But there are other solutions, right? We could create food policy aimed at corporate responsibility. Think more about life course nutrition, pregnancy, lactation, focusing more on trauma recovery, teaching people how to be deliberate and intentional. And that might include abstinent food plans, yes. And most importantly, teaching people how to get their hands dirty and learn how to cook, right? So my main hope today is that you can see that we need dialectics and dietetics. Yes, that multiple models exist. Stop extrapolating. Stop being in one camp and waging war against the other. This isn't about right or wrong or black and white. This is about intersections, shades of gray, looking at convergence and divergence. This profession that we're in has become susceptible to extreme bias based on toxic tribalism in our field. And in my opinion, this is extremely harmful to patients because they're like seeing conflictual energy, right? So when you liberate yourself from groupthink, you can have a larger impact on your patients. And this comes at a price I would definitely know, right? As someone that's willing to speak out and stand in my own truth, I have definitely faced some of the consequences of deviating from groupthink, right? And I will say that when dietitians reject food addiction, it forces people to seek coaches and other professionals, and it creates a cycle of bias. So it's like, yeah, a lot of dietitians, especially in the eating disorder world, say, this doesn't exist. My leader tells me this isn't real. I refuse to treat this. And then people go to other places, right? Who don't do well thought out, weight neutral care, and then it creates a cycle of bias, right? So people with food addiction are told that their condition is not real. They feel rejected by dietitians, and then food addiction becomes the next marginalized group. And I thought 2023 was about health equity. So if you don't understand addictions or you don't feel comfortable with different philosophies, that's fine, but don't invalidate people's lived experiences. Intuitive eating is a powerful message that I stand by. It's given a lot of dietitians a chance to have a more meaningful career in dietetics, and it's empowered a lot of people to become diet culture dropouts and experience real freedom. It's created a very powerful presence online in the era of social justice. But in my opinion, they've dug in their heels too deep in this position on ultra-processed food addiction, and they've been entirely unwilling to admit that their model is incomplete and have engaged in cancel culture activities. So how can intuitive eating be helpful to ultra-processed food addiction? If you take principle 3, the unconditional permission to eat, you can create a modification. Someone can grant unconditional permission, but still maintain the autonomy to opt out of foods that hijack brain reward circuitry. So it is very important to recognize that some people choose to avoid ultra-processed foods, not necessarily out of fear for weight gain, but rather just an interest in having fewer obsessive thoughts, not wanting to feel defeated, or simply to feel better. Principle 6, eat what you want. I think it's important to teach people that once we heal the body, improve the gut-brain axis, many people will want to eat new and different foods, foods that they love, but also that love them back. And this, in my opinion, can be an acceptable goal of treatment and recovery. So as I start wrapping up, I want to say that food addiction culture is somewhat worrisome. And yes, sometimes it makes my tummy turn, but it's not their fault, okay? We can be helpful. If we are professionals, it is our job to be helpful. One of my biggest, bones to pick with the food addiction information out there is that a lot of it tends to be math-centric, the famous calories, macros. I'm not into that stuff. I'm not into math-centric approaches to nutrition, and I probably won't be persuaded to become. But I do love addiction recovery. As you can maybe feel, it's near and dear to me, especially when it's centered on spirituality. I like to root for people who are in recovery and help them find solutions that are sustainable. This is probably because I was the underdog back in 2006, and I've grown up, right? I became a doctor last year, have started a family, and have a really fortunate life, and get to help other people on a similar trajectory. So one of the quotes from my program, the Wise Mind Nutrition app, reject false dichotomies, reclaim your individual agency and your nutritional identity. We're all individuals embedded into the context of a larger ecology that we call society. But remember who you are. We don't just live in nature, we are nature. Embrace it. So, deep final thoughts. Even in the weight neutral, non-diet era, many professionals find it difficult to endorse high levels of ultra-processed foods to patients for whom avoidance of these foods was never their problem, right? So some people don't have dietary restraint as their problem, right? And there are ways to promote health without triggering risk factors for disordered eating. Many nutrition professionals need to do their own internal work to be more effective health educators. Many, not all, proponents of all foods fit might be compensating for their own history of dieting and unresolved food and body issues, right? Working real hard to resolve their own cognitive dissonance by proving how inclusive and intuitive they are at events and on social media. Oof. Prevailing narratives and notions that are not helpful. That socially disadvantaged individuals are resigned to consuming ultra-processed food because they have no other options. Yes, there are people that face structural marginalization. What I'm saying here is that we can help overcome structural marginalization. This idea that institutions have their hands tied and can't implement change is just not a helpful notion. So solutions, right? What can we do? We can work to improve social conditions, reduce trauma exposure, develop community-based programs for early intervention, help people build resilience, to decrease weight stigma based on this food addiction data, implying that body weight is not just someone's choice. There's more to it, right? We can bring more mind-body approaches like yoga and meditation that are designed to help improve the human stress response. And we could certainly make policy proposals aimed at the food industry to reduce exposure to highly palatable foods. And I know this is easier said than done. That's not something that I think is easy. I'm not saying let's just do that. Let's just overcome capitalism and take over. I'm not saying that we can do that, but we can think about moving in that direction the same way we did with tobacco. It took 7,000 papers before we did something about tobacco. Right? And that's one of the few public health victories that we have. I hate to say it as a public health person, but we did something with tobacco, right? We can move in that direction. And it might take a couple of decades, it might take a generation, but I'm rooting for it. Potential solutions to the crises in our field. Don't participate in diet wars, okay? Instead, be curious about people and groups that might be different from you. Investigate your biases and your blind spots, and be curious about the information that makes you uncomfortable. Read more scientific papers, attend more events like these. And if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So you want to diversify your toolkit, right? Don't be a one-trick pony. Always think about things on a continuum and on a spectrum. And remember that stigma is recovery's greatest enemy. I'm going to quote a philosopher. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. At a minimum, I hope we can agree that ultra-processed food addiction overrides consumer sovereignty. I hope we can agree that corporate greed is a real problem in our world. I hope we can agree that orthorexia is a real problem, but it shouldn't invalidate the research we have on ultra-processed food addiction. And I think it's safe to say that we have a long way to go for improved mental health treatment outcomes, and definitely for improved eating disorder treatment outcomes. And that's my talk. We are coming back to the conversation about food addiction versus dietary restraint. So what we're looking for in these case studies, and these are mental health cases, are we looking at a true positive for food addiction, or are we looking at a noise, a false positive, which would be food addiction that's more characterized by dietary restraint? Okay, so that's sort of the exercise, and maybe we can get through a few of these. So yeah, as I sort of open it up for discussion, if you want to throw into the chat what you think, is this a real food addiction phenotype, or is it more likely to be eating disorder based or restraint based eating? So Alma's a 23-year-old single Colombian female. She's from a troubled household with an absent father. Father had severe alcohol use disorder. She did seek attention from older boys, mostly from her brother's friends. She always loved cooking, and she called herself a foodie. She was on the volleyball team in high school, and she pretty much loved all sports, and she was coerced into sex by the assistant coach. And she did not return to the team on the sophomore year. She lost interest in volleyball and in a lot of other things. She became promiscuous and experienced academic decline. She began binge eating on processed foods at nighttime. She started drinking more soda, coffee, and energy drinks. By the senior year of high school, she gained 40 pounds. She tried a few diets, but she never lasted more than a day or two. After she finished high school, she moved in with a boyfriend, and they began vaping every day. Now, Alma, because of her father, did not drink or use drugs, but as you can see, there was caffeine, nicotine, and highly palatable foods. They ate mostly fast food delivery. Sometimes she would cook or bake, and she got a job working as an office administrator. At some point, she stopped responding to texts from her family. She stopped posting pics on social media. Her boyfriend cheated on her, and she moved back home, not because she wanted to leave, but because he told her that she had to. Mother brought in Alma for a psych eval. She was amnestic to rape on the first session with the psychiatrist who diagnosed PTSD and DID, which, by the way, is a pretty strong diagnosis, prescribed sertraline and trazodone. They were doing outpatient psychotherapy twice a week with a social worker. Alma opened up about her sexual abuse, and when the trauma therapy started, her binging escalated significantly. She was referred to a dietitian who works in behavioral health, who administered the EDEQ, which found an absence of dietary restraint, and the Yale Food Addiction Scale 2.0, which showed severe food addiction. BMI was 36.8. So based on this case study, are we talking about food addiction or are we talking about something else? And I'm open to any ideas. As I wait for stuff to come into the chat, I can just share my thoughts. This person comes from a genetic legacy of alcoholism. She was predisposed. Ellen says something else. She was predisposed to addiction-like behaviors. I'm seeing something else. Interesting. Something else. So this doesn't look like food addiction. Okay. And I think based on what we know about the link between PTSD and food addiction, you know, when you link genetic vulnerability with trauma, and then it plays out in multiple cross addictions, I think it would be safe to say that there's definitely some addiction going on, food addiction due to a deeper matter. I like that. Yeah, I mean, all of these cases are up for debate. I do think that, you know, I think one reason why some people would think it's not food addiction is because she didn't get into alcohol and drugs. And I think that, you know, from my clinical experience, you know, some of the most severe cases of quote unquote food addiction actually only kind of mess around with food, right? Rather than it being secondary to alcohol or drugs. Okay. So again, these are on the fence cases. In my experience, I guess when I phrase the question, is it food addiction or something else? You know, I guess the better question would have been, is this food addiction or is this an eating disorder, right? Does this person have an eating disorder? And I'm sure some people would say yes. Other people would say, you know, this is a addiction like eating case. Someone's asking how we would approach this. It certainly wouldn't be like abstinence-based rigid food plans. That's like the worst thing you could do. But in a case like this, it could be clinically appropriate to focus on improving someone's nutrition through regular eating patterns, right? Consistency with food leads to consistency with life. And, you know, moving this person in a food positive and body positive way to really give the brain a break from reward-based processes, right? So I don't present this case study to say that there's an obvious path forward. You know, you certainly wouldn't want to do anything diet-based, would want non-diet approaches based in harm reduction. But this case shows in my opinion, the neurobiology of addiction like eating that's rooted in sexual abuse, trauma, and a predisposition to addictions in the family history. Jeffrey is a 27-year-old single, half Taiwanese, half white male. He grew up in a wealthy household. Father is a cardiologist with mild undiagnosed obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Mom was a swimsuit model with a long history of dieting. They both ran marathons and revered the thin ideal. Parents made negative comments about fat people. Jeffrey was diagnosed with ADHD at 9 and prescribed an amphetamine. He became a straight A student. Mom told Jeffrey to only eat carbs before, during, and after a run. And Jeffrey did his first marathon at age 15. At age 17, he got a modeling gig and was on a billboard at 6'2". In this picture, he had his shirt off. His abs were touched up in Photoshop. He had an agent who helped him grow a large Instagram following. He went to a private university and was a communications major. He switched to high dose Vyvanse and a benzo for anxiety. He spent an hour a day mirror checking his abs, and he did a freeze the fat procedure, and he was very disappointed with the results. He would run 10 miles a day on the treadmill, and he cut out all grains and dairy from his diet. He was very food negative. He made a lot of negative comments about processed food. He had relations with women, but he eventually lost interest in dating. He sought a dietitian for help with his belly fat at a BMI of 17.2, and he was then referred to a psychiatrist who diagnosed body dysmorphic disorder. The stimulants continued, and he was discontinued, I'm sorry, and he started on fluoxetine. He started binging on carbohydrates, and he would run it off after in his apartment gym. Eventually, he sprained his ankle and started purging, and now he's back to see the dietitian who used the instruments to detect high levels of dietary restraint and moderate levels of food addiction. And I saw the chat come in. Someone said this is an eating disorder. And yes, this is much more on the spectrum of restrained eating. And I think the main point in the case study is that if you just relied on the Yale food addiction scale, this person has a food addiction. But we all know after you study the case more contextually that it's not actually a food addiction. This is food addiction symptoms that are driven by body dissatisfaction and dietary restraint. And this is, in my opinion, very different than the first case, who didn't have any restrained eating and had high addiction scores. Alma scored really high on the Yale food addiction scale, and she didn't have dietary restraint. You get it? This is a case of food addiction that's driven by dietary restraint. We'll do the last one in the last 3 minutes. Whitney's a 30-year-old single white female attracted to females. Parents have no history of mental health issues. She went to college as a sociology major. In gender studies, she filled out the ACE questionnaire and she scored a 0. She began raving and attending Burning Man. She did a lot of ecstasy. She started a jewelry company with her girlfriend, moved into a condo together. They had 2 dogs and they loved hiking. At age 26, a drunk driver killed her partner. They were both in the car. Whitney shattered her female. She was completely devastated by the loss of her partner, and she had suicidal ideation. She was put on heavy doses of opioids and became dependent. She was diagnosed with PTSD, began EMDR, but she showed up often sedative and the sessions were not productive. The doctor switched her from opioids to gabapentin. She started buying oxycodone from her friends, and within months, she was smoking heroin. At age 29, she went to treatment for opioid use disorder. She was prescribed gabapentin, buspirone, methocarbamol, venlafaxine, and one other. She developed a sweet tooth and she needed candy. She had daily cigarettes and energy drinks. And then at 6 months sober, she had gained 30 pounds. Her housemate in the sober living taught her how to purge food. She found it soothing and she began purging daily, even healthy food. She had never experimented with any diets. She was referred to an outpatient eating disorder clinic where they instructed her to eat 3 meals, 2 snacks, plus dessert every day. She continued to gain weight and she eventually relapsed on heroin. She was back in detox, binging, purging on ice cream and candy. She was referred to the dietitian who found moderate levels of dietary restraint and severe food addiction. Now, this case is designed to be a little bit more tricky, a little less obvious. I think, in my opinion, vignette A was pretty obvious, genetic vulnerability to addiction, PTSD, and high Yale food addiction scales. To me, that's food addiction. The second case was a clear kind of eating disorder, dietary restraint. I saw a comment come in, sounds like a little bit of both. I do think, and I realize we're running low on time, that it can be really important to think about the timeline. And we do this in functional medicine, right? Like draw out the timeline. Which one occurred first, right? Was there addiction like symptoms first or eating disorder symptoms first, right? And in this case, right, she had no real addiction history. She did develop an addiction after a PTSD, but it came from the medications, right? She was on medications with the PTSD, and that led to cross addiction, and then she began purging. So it's not a classic case of an addiction or an eating disorder. I think realistically, this is a case that could benefit from, either sort of philosophies. I think she could do great with some good intuitive eating instruction. I generally think that the kind of food addiction models that are out there could be a little bit risky. But this is a perfect example of someone who could benefit from some sort of intervention at the intersection. In other words, yes, food positive, body positive, non-diet, weight neutral approaches, and also helping someone understand that they might be overactivating their reward system with food. And there are ways to use nutrition therapy to help heal the brain from the ravages of addiction, right? And so it's a tricky case. I certainly don't have an answer necessarily. but I go into much more detail in the paper. And then, yeah, there's 2 others, but I don't think we have time. If anyone wants to do the other 2 on their own and send me an email, I'd be happy to give you my thoughts on them. Hopefully that was helpful. I think in summary, I'd say there aren't definitive answers. It's not like, oh, this A is food addiction, it needs this, and B is, eating disorder and it needs this, and C is, somewhere in between. Although, some of that, in my opinion, feels true-ish. It's really to understand that all of these conditions exist on a continuum and a spectrum, and people can respond well to, different interventions. And what matters is that they're kept safe. We don't cause harm, and they believe in what they're doing, and they have adequate social support. So in other words, if Whitney were to do a very food inclusive intuitive eating model, if she had other people around her that were doing that, that would be fantastic. That would probably be the thing that works. If she had other people in her world that were like, into fitness and into quote unquote clean eating, and it wasn't a risk factor for orthorexia, and she really worked toward improving her nutrition and getting into exercise and using nutrition and exercise to improve her mental health, that might be beneficial for her as well, provided she had adequate, caring, respecting, and loving sources of social support. And that's also what really matters. Studying an individual case and looking at their labs and their scores on certain tests are great, but we always have to put it into context of their life and their social environment and what's realistic for that person. So I'll conclude by saying that Whitney could probably go in either direction based on what's available, and would probably do best with some combination of the 2. Thank you guys so much.